Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snooze Voyager, the only history channel where we tuck you in, blow your mind, and send you gently spiraling into unconsciousness before the credits roll. Tonight we're going somewhere strange, somewhere that will make you question everything you think you know about ancient humans, specifically whether or not they were complete lunatics. Because tonight we are talking about Göbekli Tepe, a massive, impossibly sophisticated stone temple complex built 12,000 years ago by hunter-gatherers, people who, according to everything we used to believe, should have been way too busy not dying to build anything at all. And then, for reasons that no one fully understands, they buried the whole thing, on purpose. Every pillar, every carved animal, every monumental ring of T-shaped limestone buried under tons of rubble and dirt, like someone deciding to fill their own swimming pool with concrete and walk away. Before we get into it, a quick but genuine ask. If you like what I do here, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. It takes about 2 seconds, and it genuinely means the world to me. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is wherever you are. And if you've been wanting me to cover Göbekli Tepe for a while, this one's for you. Now, dim those lights, flip on a fan, pull your blanket up to whatever your comfort threshold is, and let's just pause here for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to live 12,000 years ago? Not in a cozy cave with fairy lights. I mean actually live it. Did ancient people have a concept of Monday? Did they get stressed? Did someone at some point look at a 30-ton limestone pillar and say, yeah, I think we should probably move that? Why would you spend decades carving elaborate reliefs of foxes and vultures and headless men only to bury it all? Was it ritual? Was it fear? Was it the world's first case of a group project no one wanted to explain to the next generation? Could you personally survive a single week in 10,000 BCE without access to ibuprofen, a mattress, or the option of ordering food? And congratulations, you've just woken up in 9,000 BCE. You're somewhere what will one day become southeastern Turkey. It is cold, there is no agriculture, there is no pottery, there are no cities, there is just you, a flint tool, and a hillside full of enormous mysterious stones that your people have been carving for centuries. Welcome to the beginning of everything. Try not to overthink it. Let's start with the most important fact about Göbekli Tepe, which is that it should not exist. Not because it's supernatural, though it's certainly strange enough to feel that way at 3 a.m, but because everything we thought we knew about this period of human history said it was impossible. The site sits on a barren limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia, in what is now modern Turkey, not far from the Syrian border. It was noticed by Western archaeologists in 1963, surveyed, and then largely dismissed. The stone tools found there led researchers to assume it was a medieval cemetery. They moved on. It was not until German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived in 1994 and actually started digging that the world quietly had its mind blown. What he found beneath that hill was a complex of massive circular enclosures, rings of enormous carved T-shaped limestone pillars arranged with what could only be described as deliberate, organised, intentional architecture. And the kicker? Radiocarbon dating put the earliest construction at around 9,600 BCE. That is 12,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, it is 7,000 years older than Stonehenge. It predates the invention of writing by 6,000 years. It predates pottery. It predates farming. Which means the people who built it were not farmers with a little spare time on their hands. They were nomadic hunter-gatherers, people who, by the previous consensus of archaeology, should have been entirely too busy surviving to organise anything more architecturally ambitious than a decent windbreak. Think about that for a second. We've spent centuries telling ourselves a very tidy story about how civilization works. First you settle down, then you get organised, then you build big, impressive things. Göbekli Tepe looks at that story and buries it under several tons of Neolithic rubble. And the site is not small. It is not some modest little ring of stones you might almost miss on a country walk. The enclosures are large, some up to 30 metres in diameter. The pillars within them are enormous. The labour required to produce this place was staggering, and we will get to that, and when we do you will feel a very specific kind of tired just listening. But for now, you're standing at the base of a limestone ridge in prehistoric Turkey, and nothing about this hill makes sense yet, and that is exactly the right way to begin. Here is what you can see from where you're standing. The ridge runs roughly north to south. It is not a naturally dramatic landscape. It's dry, pale, scrubby, the kind of terrain that doesn't immediately announce itself as significant. But then you start to notice the tops of stones jutting from the earth, T-shaped, precisely cut, arranged in a curve, and once you see one, you start to see them everywhere, or rather, you start to understand that what looks like a natural hillside is not a natural hillside at all. It is a hill made partly of deliberate fill, of rubble heaped over buried structures, which means the landscape itself is an archaeological object. The hill is the site. The site is the hill. It's the same feeling you might get if you went to move your couch and discovered your entire house was built on top of something else. For 60 years, the world walked past this hill and did not look down. When we finally did, the ground told us something we were not prepared to hear, that the story of civilization begins earlier than we thought, that the people who lived before everything we call history were not waiting passively for history to begin. They were already doing something extraordinary, and they had been doing it for a very long time. Before we go any further, let's talk about who you actually are in this world, because context matters, and the context here is both humbling and deeply inconvenient. You are a hunter-gatherer living in what archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic period, which is a very academic way of saying you have no pots, no farms, no villages, and no Reddit. Your entire social unit is a small mobile band of somewhere between 20 and 50 people. You follow game, you forage, you move constantly. Your home is not a home in any modern sense, it is wherever you stop tonight. You carry everything you own, which is not very much. A few tools, some animal skins, the emotional weight of 12,000 years of prehistory that no one has written down yet. Your skill set, however, is genuinely impressive, even by modern standards, especially by modern standards, actually, because most modern people would last approximately 4 days in your world before making a series of increasingly bad decisions. You know which plants will kill you. You know how to read animal tracks in frost, in mud, in dust, at distances that would seem impossible to someone who learned about nature from a documentary on a comfortable sofa. You know how to knap flint, to strike it at exactly the right angle to produce a sharp, usable edge, a skill that takes years to develop, and that most archaeologists today cannot do particularly well even after extensive practice. You know how to start a fire without matches, which sounds romantic until you've actually tried it, at which point it stops being romantic and becomes a lesson in humility and blisters. You know the rhythms of the seasons in a specific embodied way, not as information, not as something you looked up, but as knowledge that lives in your body because you have been paying attention to the same landscape since you were old enough to walk through it. You know which hillside the wild einkorn grain grows thickest on in late summer. You know the particular quality of light that comes just before a storm. You know the calls of birds well enough to distinguish not just the species, but the mood, the alarm call that means a predator is close, the different alarm call that means the predator is very close, the silence that means it is too late to discuss the matter. You are, by any fair measure, not a simple person. You are not a stepping stone on the way to a more evolved future human. You are a fully modern human being, neurologically identical to the person reading these words right now, operating in an environment of extraordinary complexity, with a knowledge base that took thousands of years to accumulate and would take a lifetime to fully learn. The brain inside your skull runs the same software as every brain alive today. It just has different inputs, fewer notifications, more immediate consequences. The popular image of prehistoric humanity, stooped, grunting, fumbling through a dim and brutish existence, was never accurate, and Göbekli Tepe is perhaps the most emphatic possible proof of that. The people of this era didn't build the world's first monumental architecture because they stumbled into it accidentally. They built it because they were the kind of creatures who could conceive of it, plan it, coordinate the labour required for it, and execute it across generations. That is not a primitive capability. That is a profound one. You should know that about yourself, standing here at the base of this limestone ridge. Before we go any further, you're not lesser, you're simply earlier. Let's talk about mornings. Specifically, your mornings. Because the Younger Dryas, the long cold snap that preceded the warming period in which Göbekli Tepe was built, had only recently ended, and the climate of this region was in a state of dramatic, unpredictable flux. This is not a cosy medieval peasant kind of cold, or at least you have a stone cottage and a fire indoors. This is the full, open, relentless cold of a world still shaking itself out of an ice age. You wake up, and wake up is a generous term for what is essentially the daily process of realizing you are still alive, on the ground, or possibly on a pile of animal skins in the dark. The first thing you feel is the specific kind of damp cold that has worked its way into your joints overnight and made itself at home there. Not dramatically painful, just present. The kind of cold that modern people who sleep in climate-controlled rooms on memory foam mattresses have entirely forgotten is possible, and which you have simply accepted as the baseline condition of existence, the way a fish accepts water. There is no alarm, there is no snooze button, there is no moment of lying there for 10 more minutes scrolling through something on your phone. What there is the sound of other people in your group beginning to stir, the thin grey light of pre-dawn filtering in from whatever direction you happen to be sheltering from, and the immediate, undeferrable, non-negotiable, practical problem of, what are we eating today? This is not a philosophical question. This is the question. It precedes everything else. It organises the day before the day has properly started. The shelter itself varies depending on the season and the landscape. You have not, contrary to popular assumption, spent your entire life in a cave. Most caves are cold, damp, echoey, occupied by other animals who object to your presence, and considerably less comfortable than a simple structure built from branches and skins in a sheltered valley. Your people know how to build quickly and adequately for the conditions. The structures are not elaborate because elaborate is heavy and you move too much to carry heavy. But they are functional, and this morning, as you push through the low entrance into the pale early light, they have done their job. You are cold. You are not frozen. These are meaningfully different outcomes. The landscape outside is extraordinary in the way that landscapes are extraordinary when there is nothing else competing for your attention. No sounds except the wind, the distant call of a bird, the movement of someone else in the camp. The sky's pale orange at the edges and going blue fast. The air has that particular early morning quality that people who are outside before sunrise sometimes notice, and that most people today never experience at all because they are indoors until the day is already well underway. You crouch by the remains of last night's fire and bring it back from embers. This is a skill in itself, knowing how to bank coals so the fire survives the night, reading the pale ash for the orange glow hidden beneath it. The smoke rises straight up in the still air. Someone else joins you. There is no conversation yet. There does not need to be. You have been doing this together long enough that the morning has its own rhythm, its own quiet competence that does not require words. By the time the sun has cleared the horizon, the day has already decided what it's going to be, and you are ready more or less to go meet it. You are hungry. This is not an unusual state. It is, in fact, the defining atmospheric condition of your existence, the background hum beneath everything else. The region around what will become Göbekli Tepe is rich by Neolithic standards. The Fertile Crescent is not called that as a compliment to its charm, but because it genuinely supports a diverse ecosystem of wild game, migratory birds, wild cereals, legumes, nuts and fruits, in quantities that would have seemed extraordinary to hunter-gatherers living further north or further into the interior. But plenty by Neolithic standards is still not plenty in the sense your modern self would recognise. Plenty here means you will probably eat today, and with some effort, eat reasonably well. It does not mean eat whatever you feel like. It does not mean eat until you are completely satisfied, and then have a second helping. It means eat enough to keep moving, eat enough to stay functional, eat enough to do it all again tomorrow. Gazelle are plentiful in this region, moving in herds across the open landscape, which sounds convenient until you factor in that catching one requires sustained pursuit, accurate throwing of a spear at a moving target at distance, and the subsequent practical work of processing a whole animal with stone tools in the field before it attracts every predator in the area. Aurochs, the enormous wild ancestors of modern cattle, roam the hills and river valleys. They are enormous. They are fast. They are aggressive. Hunting one is not a solo activity, not a casual afternoon project. It is a coordinated group effort with significant physical risk to everyone involved. Undertaken because the reward, an enormous quantity of meat, justifies the danger. Wild boar are smaller and more tractable, but make up for this by having terrible personalities. Small game fills in the gaps. Hares, birds, fish from the rivers when you're near them. Wild einkorn wheat grows here, not yet cultivated, not yet domesticated, just growing stubbornly in the rocky soil of the hillsides, waiting for someone to notice that it grows better in disturbed ground and that you can influence where it grows if you're paying attention and willing to be deliberate about it. That realization is coming, historically speaking. It is only 1,000 or so years away, but it has not arrived yet. For now, the grain is gathered. You know which hillsides, you know the season. You go when it is ready, harvest it by hand, carry it back, and process it between two flat stones into something that technically qualifies as food, and that would be described today, without any irony, as rustic stone-ground ancient grain. You do not call it that. You call it dinner. Then there are the nuts, pistachios, almonds, wild lentils, the bitter and the sweet, the edible and the ones that will make you regret your choices, seasonal fruits, roots and tubers that require knowing where to look and what to dig up, because not everything underground is edible and some of it is specifically, aggressively not. This knowledge, all of it, the hunting and the foraging and the processing and the preserving, is not written down anywhere. It lives in people. It is transmitted through demonstration and practice, through years of watching and doing, and losing some of it is a catastrophe in a way that losing a file on a computer, annoying as that is, genuinely is not. Hunger sharpens everything. It makes the morning more urgent and the evening more satisfying. It makes the smell of roasting meat over a fire one of the most purely good things you have ever experienced. It also makes the occasional bad day, the failed hunt, the lean season, the river that ran lower than expected, something that lands with a weight. Modern comfort does not prepare you for. Food here is not background. Food is the whole foreground. Everything else, including the 12,000-year-old temple on the hill, is what happens in the spaces around it. Here is the paradox at the heart of everything tonight, and it is a good one. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not supposed to be able to build Göbekli Tepe. The traditional model of human civilization, the one that was taught in schools for most of the 20th century, printed in textbooks, accepted as settled fact, presented as a logical progression that basically made sense, went something like this. First, humans domesticated plants and animals and developed agriculture. Then, because they had surplus food, they could settle in one place without having to follow it. Then, because they were settled, they could develop complex social organization, specialization of labor, class structure, the whole apparatus. And then, and only then, with all of those building blocks in place, could they begin constructing monumental architecture, engaging in organized religion, doing the large-scale collective things that we associate with civilization. This is called the Neolithic Revolution, and it is a perfectly tidy story with a satisfying internal logic. Göbekli Tepe demolishes it. Completely. Politely. But entirely. Because Göbekli Tepe is 12,000 years old and farming does not appear in this region until about 10,500 BCE, which means the people who quarried, transported, carved, and erected enormous stone pillars were doing all of it without the supposed prerequisite of agriculture. They were doing it without pottery, without permanent settlements, without, as far as we can tell, any of the things the model said they needed first. They skipped the prerequisites and went straight to the cathedral. This has forced a quiet, significant rethink in the archaeology of this period. Not a loud, dramatic revolution, academics tend to process paradigm shifts with a certain careful dignity, but a genuine revision of the foundational assumptions about what hunter-gatherers were and were not capable of. The old framing treated the people of the pre-pottery Neolithic as proto-farmers in waiting, essentially biding their time in a less organised state until agriculture arrived to unlock their potential. The new framing, which Göbekli Tepe has done more than any other single site to establish, treats them as what they actually were: sophisticated, socially complex, symbolically fluent people who organised themselves on a large scale not despite the absence of agriculture but independently of it. Think about what that actually requires. Moving a 20-ton stone pillar up a ridge, with no wheels, no draft animals, no metal tools. Working estimates suggest this needed somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people working in concert. 500 people, for a social group whose normal operating size was somewhere between 20 and 50. The numbers only work if you're drawing from multiple groups simultaneously, coordinating across what must have been a wide regional network, operating on the basis of shared purpose and shared understanding of what this place was for and why it mattered enough to show up for. That coordination does not happen by accident. It does not happen between people who have nothing in common. It happens between people who share a symbolic world, a cosmology, a set of beliefs about the nature of things, a reason to keep coming back to the same place and doing the same demanding, exhausting, dangerous work together. Before the first pillar was ever raised at Göbekli Tepe, before the first stone was cut, the social and symbolic infrastructure required to make it possible was already in place. The cathedral came after the faith, not before, and the faith was already old. Let's talk about the stones, because the stones are the whole story. Stand in the middle of one of Göbekli Tepe's enclosures, and there are at least 20 of them identified so far, though most are still buried and waiting, and look around you. What you see are T-shaped limestone pillars, arranged in rough circles or ovals, ranging in height from around 1.5 meters up to more than 5 meters tall. The tallest weigh approximately 20 tons. They are not rough, unworked lumps of rock dragged up from the valley and stood on their ends. They are precisely shaped. The T-shape is intentional and consistent across the site and across time, a recognizable, repeated form that clearly carried meaning, whatever that meaning was. And many of them are covered, absolutely covered, in carved reliefs. Animals emerge from the stone in startling, accomplished detail. Foxes, vultures, scorpions, snakes winding along the edges of pillars, wild boar in aggressive postures, gazelles in motion, lions, ducks, insects. The diversity of the animal imagery is remarkable, and it is not random. The same animals recur across different enclosures with a consistency that suggests they were part of a shared symbolic language, rather than individual artistic choices. These were not artists decorating to their own taste. They were communicating something specific in a visual vocabulary that their audience already understood. The carving itself is not primitive. That word gets applied too liberally to things made a long time ago, and it is particularly wrong here. The relief work at Göbekli Tepe is accomplished. The animals have volume and movement. The composition, the placement of figures on the pillar face, the use of the T-shaped shoulders as a kind of frame is considered. These were not people picking up a sharp stone and scratching something into rock on a slow afternoon. They were artists with standards, working within an established tradition, producing work that was intended to be significant and to look it. Now focus on the 2 central pillars in each enclosure, because these are the ones that will rearrange something in your understanding of this place. They are taller than the surrounding stones. They face each other across the centre of the ring, and they have something the others largely do not: human features. Arms are carved in low relief along their sides, running down toward a belt-like band carved around their middles. Hands rest near the front of the pillar at approximately hip height, with fingers visible. They appear to wear garments. There are what look like loincloth-style elements in the carving. They have no faces carved on the flat top of the T, but the overall form is unmistakably body-like, upright, facing inward, present. Researchers believe these central pillars represent beings of some kind, spiritual figures, ancestors, gods, intermediaries, between the human world and whatever the people of Göbekli Tepe understood to lie beyond it. Whether you think of them as supernatural, or simply as representations of revered human figures no longer living, the effect is the same. Standing between them in the firelight of a Neolithic gathering, you would not have felt alone. You're looking, if you are willing to see it this way, at the world's oldest known figurative sculpture program. Older than the Venus figurines of Europe, older than the cave paintings of France and Spain in their organised symbolic complexity, older than anything else we have found that suggests a shared visual language operating at this scale. The people who made these pillars were not at the beginning of art. They were already well into it. Let's take a moment to appreciate what it actually takes to move a 20-ton limestone pillar up a hill. Not in a motivational sense, not in a look at the indomitable human spirit sense, in a completely literal, physical, logistical, where do you even begin sense, because the logistics here are genuinely extraordinary, and they deserve a moment of proper attention before we move on. The limestone bedrock at Göbekli Tepe is close to the surface, which is part of why the quarrying happened nearby. You did not need to source material from far away, which was fortunate, because sourcing it from far away with the technology available would have been somewhere between nightmarish and impossible. Archaeologists have found unfinished pillars still lying in the bedrock of the quarry area, attached at one edge, partially cut, abandoned mid-process. Some of these are enormous. One measures approximately 9 meters in length and would have weighed around 50 tons if finished. It was never finished. It just lies there in the rock, a half-formed idea, which is both a logistical data point and, if you let it be, one of the most quietly haunting things at the entire site. The cutting was done with flint tools, not metal, not iron, not bronze. Flint, shaped into chisels and hammerstones, used by people lying in the dust and striking at limestone one small piece at a time. This was slow. This required enormous sustained collective effort over a very long period, and it required skilled people who knew stone, who understood the structure of limestone, who could look at a piece of bedrock and determine how to cut it in a way that produced the intended shape without shattering it. This was not unskilled labour. This was craft, operating at industrial scale. Once cut, the pillar had to be moved. There were no wheels in this era. The wheel does not appear until somewhere around 3500 BCE, thousands of years in the future. Draft animals had not yet been domesticated for labour. The aurochs, the only large bovine candidate in the region, was not cooperating and would not be domesticated for another 2,000 years. Experimental archaeologists, the people who test ancient methods by actually trying them, have worked out that moving a pillar of 20 tons over short distances on a relatively flat surface, using timber rollers and ropes made from plant fibre or leather, would require somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people working together in a coordinated sequence. 500. For a social group whose normal operational size was 20 to 50 people. The arithmetic here is not subtle. You cannot do this alone. You cannot do this with your band. You cannot do this with 2 bands. You need people from across a wide region, organised around a shared purpose, showing up and working together in numbers that have no parallel anywhere else on Earth at this moment in time. And then, once the pillar is at the site, it has to be raised, stood upright in a prepared stone socket precisely positioned within the enclosure's geometry, oriented correctly relative to the other pillars and to whatever celestial or symbolic alignment the builders were working toward. None of this was improvised. All of it was planned by people who had no writing, no technical drawings, no surveying equipment beyond what they could construct from available materials and accumulated knowledge, and the results were precise enough that we can still measure the alignments 12,000 years later and find them meaningful. Whatever system they were using, it worked, which means the people who designed it knew what they were doing, and that is a fact that should keep you wide awake. But hopefully it won't. This is the question that has been quietly bothering archaeologists since the site was first properly excavated, and they have not arrived at a comfortable answer. Somebody organised this. The logistics we just walked through, the quarrying, the moving, the raising, the carving, do not self-organise. They require coordination across time and space and between groups of people who did not necessarily live together or speak identical languages. Somebody decided which stones went where, which animals got carved on which pillars, which enclosures got built in which sequence. Somebody managed the feeding of the workers. Those enormous quantities of animal bones represent meals that had to be organised, hunted, butchered, and distributed. Somebody resolved the inevitable disputes. Somebody kept the whole operation running across what appears to have been centuries of continuous construction and active use, passing knowledge and authority across generations so that the project did not die with any individual. But here is the puzzle. Göbekli Tepe shows no evidence of a ruling class in the way we typically understand it. There are no palaces, no buildings of a scale or elaboration that would indicate elite residential use, no rich burials overflowing with prestige goods, no jewellery, no weapons, no status objects deposited with one individual in a way that would announce this person mattered more than others. The site does not look like it was built by a hierarchical society with a king or a chief at the top. It looks, in the material record, more equal than that. What archaeologists find instead is evidence of communal feasting on an enormous scale. Vast quantities of animal bones, the remains of wild aurochs and gazelles consumed in large, organised gatherings. The bones are not scattered randomly. They are deposited in patterns that suggest structured, repeated, ritualised eating events. Feasts, the kind of feast that required significant advanced planning, coordinated hunting effort, and the gathering of large numbers of people at predictable times. The leading interpretation is that Göbekli Tepe was a pilgrimage site, a place that drew hunter-gatherer groups from across a wide region for periodic gatherings that were simultaneously religious, social, and practical, occasions to reaffirm shared identity, exchange information, arrange partnerships, and participate in rituals that tied the community together across the distances that normally separated them. The authority that made this work was probably not the authority of a chief with power over life and death. It was something older, and in some ways more durable, the authority of the sacred. People came because they believed they had to come. The work was done because the work was understood as obligatory in the deepest possible sense, not optional, not negotiable, not contingent on a particular leader's personality or power, but necessary in the same way that seasonal migration is necessary. The site itself was the authority. And somebody understood how to build a site that could carry that kind of weight for 2,000 years. We do not know their name. We don't know what they looked like, how they spoke, what they believed in specific terms. They left nothing behind that tells us, except the stones, which given the circumstances is probably enough. The carved animals at Göbekli Tepe are not random. This is the consensus among the researchers who have studied them most carefully, and it is an important starting point, because once you begin looking at the imagery with sustained attention, really looking past the initial impression of general ancient weirdness, patterns emerge that suggest something organised and intentional, a visual language, a shared symbolic vocabulary that meant something specific and probably complex to the people who made it and the people who gathered in its presence. Vultures appear frequently, and they carry weight wherever they appear. In many ancient Near Eastern cultures, vultures are associated with death and with the transition between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond it. They are birds that consume the dead. They are the mechanism by which a body returns to the world, and in a culture that practiced excarnation, the deliberate exposure of the dead to birds and the elements, the vulture would have been a figure of profound ritual significance, rather than simply a scavenger. The vulture does not merely eat the dead. In this symbolic framework, the vulture carries something across a threshold. At Göbekli Tepe, vultures appear in a remarkable carved scene, in which they seem to carry spherical objects interpreted by many researchers as human heads. Headless human figures appear nearby. This is not a hunting scene. This is not decoration. This is a narrative in stone about something that happens at or after death. Foxes are abundant across the site, consistently associated with the lower portions of the central pillars, particularly near what would correspond to the waist or loins of the anthropomorphic figures those pillars appear to represent. Foxes in later Mesopotamian symbolism are associated with trickery, the underworld, and ambiguous liminal states, neither fully wild nor domestic, neither fully dangerous nor fully safe. Whether these associations extend back to Göbekli Tepe is uncertain, but the positioning of fox imagery is too consistent to be accidental. Snakes wind their way across pillar faces with a kind of fluid insistence that suggests they were not chosen casually. Scorpions cluster in configurations that feel deliberate. Boars appear in aggressive, raised bristle postures that may indicate danger or power or both. The duck, appearing in more placid compositions, may carry different valence entirely. Some researchers, most notably Juan Antonio Belmonte and Giulio Madli, have proposed that certain groupings of animals at Göbekli Tepe correspond to ancient star constellations, that what looks like a carved fox is also a particular star pattern, and that the carved scenes encode astronomical information in a form designed to be read by people who already knew the sky intimately. Others argue for totemic clan identification, that the animals represent the different groups who participated in the site's construction, a visual registry of who was here and who contributed. Others still maintain a more straightforwardly religious interpretation. These are sacred beings, and their presence on the pillars consecrates the space. The honest position, which is also the most interesting position, is that all of these interpretations may simultaneously be true. Symbolic systems in cultures without writing do not operate in clean, separate categories. An animal can be a clan symbol, and a constellation, and a sacred being, and a death-associated spirit all at once. The richness of the imagery at Göbekli Tepe may reflect exactly that kind of layered, multivalent symbolic world. We are reading a language by examining its characters without a dictionary. We can see that it is a language. The translation is still ongoing. Close your eyes for a moment, or don't. You're probably already halfway there, and honestly, wherever you are right now is exactly the right place to be for this part. Imagine Göbekli Tepe at night. Not the Göbekli Tepe of the excavation photographs, all pale limestone under a Mediterranean sun, tidy and gridded and measured. The Göbekli Tepe of 12,000 years ago, at full use, in the dark. The sky above is extraordinary, and it is not possible to overstate how extraordinary it is. There is no artificial light anywhere, not in this century, not on this continent, not on this planet. The Milky Way is not the faint smear that most people today occasionally glimpse from a dark enough hillside. It is a river, a dense, luminous, textured river of light stretching horizon to horizon, with depth and structure and colour, so present it casts a faint shadow. People of this era lived under this sky every night, and still looked up at it with the kind of attention we reserve for things that surprise us. The stars were not background, they were not screensavers, they were the most complex, most reliable, most sacred text in the world. A text that moved and changed and repeated on cycles that, if you watched carefully enough across a lifetime and talked to people who had watched carefully across theirs, began to reveal a grammar. Down on the ridge, the enclosures are lit by fire, torches possibly, or open fires built between and around the pillars, casting light that moves and shifts with the breathing of the flame. The carved animals on the pillar faces catch the light differently depending on how the fire moves. A fox freezes, a vulture seems to lean, a snake appears to coil more tightly in the shadow. The effect is not static. The imagery is alive in the way that firelit images are always alive, in a way that cannot be replicated under electric light no matter how carefully you arrange it. This is, in part, the point. The pillars were designed to be seen this way. Their visual effect was calibrated for this specific experience. There are people here, many more people than any single group would normally travel with. Different faces, different ways of speaking, different accents on the shared words, different small habits of gesture and posture that mark them as from a different valley, a different river, a different stretch of this enormous and largely empty landscape. They have brought food because the bones confirm it. Enormous quantities of wild aurochs and gazelle were slaughtered and consumed here. Meals prepared for hundreds, the organised abundance of a feast. Fermented drink, quite possibly. The social ease that comes from shared eating and drinking in a lit space, surrounded by familiar ritual. There may be music. There is almost certainly something that functions as music. Percussion at minimum, rhythm, possibly voice. There are structured movements, what we would recognise from a distance as ceremony. Repeated actions, repeated words or sounds, the choreography of ritual that turns a gathering of separate people into a single, coordinated body, even briefly, even imperfectly. This site functioned actively for at least 2,000 years. That is not a short time. It is longer than the entire span from the birth of Rome to now. Whatever happened in these enclosures, at night under those stars, was compelling enough that people kept coming back across a span of time so vast it is difficult to hold in the mind. Something here worked. Something here answered a question that human beings had been carrying since they were human beings. You're sitting by one of those fires right now, listening to the dark, and you do not have the words for it, but you know it matters. Let's talk about what people were actually eating at these gatherings, because the archaeological evidence is unusually clear on this point, and it tells a genuinely fascinating story. The bones recovered from Göbekli Tepe represent thousands of animals. The scale of consumption here was massive and sustained over centuries. Wild aurochs dominate the record. These were not small animals. The aurochs was the enormous, aggressive, wild ancestor of modern cattle, standing nearly 2 meters at the shoulder and weighing upwards of 1,000 kilograms. Hunting one was not a casual afternoon activity. It required coordinated group effort, considerable risk, and the kind of pre-hunt organisation that in itself suggests a sophisticated social structure. To put the aurochs in perspective, imagine hunting something the size and temperament of a large rhinoceros, armed with a flint-tipped spear and the cooperation of however many people you could reliably convince to stand in the path of it with you. This was not a task for the faint-hearted or the disorganised. The aurochs was fast, aggressive, and equipped with horns that could and frequently did rearrange the plans of anyone who miscalculated the approach. Bringing one down required strategy, driving, surrounding, exhausting the animal before the final close-range work, and it required people who trusted each other enough to hold their positions when a 1,000-kilogram animal was moving toward them at speed. Gazelle bones appear in enormous quantities alongside the aurochs' remains. Gazelle were migratory in this region, arriving in vast herds at predictable times of year, and their presence in the Göbekli Tepe bone record in such volume suggests the major gatherings at the site may have been deliberately timed to coincide with these migrations. This was not coincidence. This was scheduling. Many somebodies across many generations understood that if you want to feed several hundred people at a pilgrimage site, you coordinate your religious calendar with the natural calendar. The gazelle arrive, the people arrive, the feast and the ritual happen together, which is extremely sensible logistically, and also suggests a level of calendrical awareness that we might not expect from people who, according to the old textbooks, were barely keeping the lights on. Wild boar appear in the record as well, which tracks with their presence in the carved imagery on the pillars. The boar at Göbekli Tepe seems to have carried both symbolic weight and culinary value, which is a combination that would be familiar to many cultures across history and several European countries today. Smaller game fills out the picture. Birds, hares, the occasional fish when proximity to water allowed. The diet of the gatherers was varied, high in protein, and by the evidence of the bone quantities genuinely abundant during the feast periods in a way that normal daily foraging life probably was not. And then there are the large stone bowls. Multiple examples have been found at the site. Basalt vessels of considerable size, some with a capacity of up to 160 litres. 160 litres, that is not a cooking pot. That is not a water jug. That is a vessel designed for producing something in bulk. And the most plausible candidates, given the grain processing evidence also present at the site, are a thick grain-based porridge, or perhaps more intriguingly, a fermented grain drink. Something, in other words, that is recognisably ancestral to beer. The world's oldest known temple may have been, among other things, the world's oldest known brewery. This information should be deeply comforting to everyone listening. It suggests that the human instinct to gather in a significant place, share a meal, and consume something fermented together while contemplating the large questions is not a modern indulgence. It is 12,000 years old. It may in fact be one of the things that made us who we are. Here is a theory that is not yet proven but absolutely refuses to go away, and it is the kind of idea that sounds completely backwards until you sit with it for a moment, at which point it starts to feel uncomfortably plausible. The traditional story, as we have established, is that farming came first, and then temples and complex society followed. Surplus food enabled settlement, settlement enabled organisation, organisation enabled monuments. Neat, linear, logical. Göbekli Tepe already complicated the chronology, but some researchers have gone further and proposed that the relationship between this site and the origins of agriculture may have run not just in parallel, but in direct causal sequence, and in the opposite direction to what the textbook assumed. The argument goes like this. Maintaining a major pilgrimage site that regularly attracted hundreds of people from across a wide region created a logistical problem of a very specific and recurring kind. You need to feed those people. Foraging and hunting, however skilled the practitioners, cannot reliably produce the concentrated, predictable quantities of food required to feed several hundred people in one place over several days, repeatedly on a seasonal schedule for centuries. The pressure of that requirement, the necessity of producing more food more reliably at a predictable location, would have been a powerful incentive to experiment with the deliberate cultivation of wild plants. To try planting some of the grain near the site rather than only harvesting it from wherever it happened to grow. To see what happens if you tend it rather than just visit it. In other words, the temple created the need that agriculture answered. Ritual obligation may have been the engine of one of the most consequential developments in human history. The need to keep showing up and feeding people at a sacred site may have pushed human beings, almost accidentally, toward farming. The geographic evidence is suggestive to the point of being uncomfortable to dismiss. The oldest evidence of proto-agriculture in this region, the first tentative experimental steps toward the cultivation of wild cereals dates to around 10,500 BCE, appearing within a radius of roughly 200 kilometers of Göbekli Tepe. The wild einkorn wheat that was first domesticated anywhere on Earth, as far as current evidence indicates, was domesticated on the slopes of Karakadar, a mountain located approximately 30 kilometers from the site. 30 kilometers. In a world of foragers accustomed to covering large distances on foot, that is not a long way. That is a day's walk. That is well within the regional network that Göbekli Tepe demonstrably drew from. Whether this is coincidence or causation cannot be proven from the current evidence. The archaeological record does not yet speak clearly enough to settle the question. But the possibility, seriously entertained by serious researchers, that organised religion, or at least organised ritual, preceded and perhaps directly drove the agricultural revolution, is one of the most genuinely destabilising ideas to have emerged from this site, and it has not gone away under scrutiny. It has only become more interesting. Because if it is true, it changes not just the sequence, but the meaning. It means that what drove the transformation of human civilization was not primarily material, not survival pressure or resource scarcity or clever practical invention. It was something more like faith. The decision to cultivate the earth may have grown, however indirectly, from the decision to build a temple on a hill and keep coming back to it, which suggests that the impulse toward the sacred was not a product of civilization. It may have been one of its primary causes. For a site as significant and intensively studied as Göbekli Tepe, the human skeletal remains are frustratingly scarce, and that scarcity is itself a meaningful piece of evidence rather than simply a gap in the record. No formal burials have been found within or beneath the enclosures. No tombs, no grave goods, no deliberate interments of the kind that typically mark a funerary site in the way archaeologists expect and know how to interpret. The absence of formal burial in a place that was clearly used with great deliberateness over centuries is a puzzle, and puzzles at Göbekli Tepe tend to be the most interesting parts of the story. What has been found, in smaller quantities and in less structured positions, are fragments of human bone, scattered, in some cases worked, in some cases deposited in ways that suggest they were placed deliberately rather than simply accumulated through normal occupation. Skull fragments in particular appear with a consistency that seems too regular to be accidental, and some of these skull fragments are remarkable. They show evidence of deliberate modification after death, fine-cut marks following precise trajectories on the outer surface of the skull, carved grooves running along the cranial vault, and in some cases what appear to be intentional perforations, holes, carefully made, that may have allowed the skull to be suspended or worn. This is not, in the context of the period, as alarming as it sounds from the comfortable remove of the present. Skull cults, the ritual treatment, curation, and display of human skulls, are documented across a wide range of cultures in the Neolithic Near East and beyond. At the roughly contemporary site of Jericho, plastered skulls with modelled facial features were found, the remains of what appear to have been ancestor figures kept among the living. The skull, in many of these cultures, appears to have been understood as the essential seat of personhood, the most potent physical remnant of a specific human being, something too important to simply bury and forget. A skull preserved and displayed is not a morbid trophy. It is a continued presence, a way of keeping someone in the conversation after they have physically left it. The fragments at Göbekli Tepe were not found in domestic contexts. They were found across the site in distributions that suggest ritual deposition, placed in specific locations as part of specific activities, rather than discarded as waste or accumulating through ordinary habitation. 3 deliberately modified skulls have been studied in detail, and researchers have proposed that the grooves and perforations on them indicate they were displayed, perhaps suspended, perhaps worn, as part of the ritual life of the site. The dead were not buried and left behind at Göbekli Tepe. They appear to have continued participating. In what form and to what purpose, the bones alone cannot tell us. But the intentionality is clear. These remains were handled with care, modified with skill, and placed with deliberateness by people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. What this tells us, at the very least, is that the boundary between the living and the dead at Göbekli Tepe was not a hard line. The ancestors were present here. The dead were part of whatever was happening in these enclosures, part of the ritual fabric, part of the community that gathered at this place, part of the reason it mattered to keep coming back. This is not primitive superstition. It is a sophisticated theological position about continuity, about what persists after death, about the obligations the living carry toward those who came before them. You might disagree with the cosmology. You would have trouble arguing with the seriousness of it. One of the more quietly spectacular claims about Göbekli Tepe, and there are several to choose from, which is part of what makes this site so relentlessly interesting, is that it is, at least in part, an astronomical observatory. Not an observatory in the sense of a building with a telescope and a gift shop. An observatory in the older, deeper sense, a place deliberately constructed and oriented to encode, preserve and communicate knowledge about the sky and the movement of celestial bodies across time. This claim requires careful handling because archaeastronomy, the study of astronomical knowledge in ancient cultures, is a field that demands epistemic humility. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures in a cosmos that contains an essentially unlimited supply of patterns, and the history of archaeoastronomy includes a number of enthusiastic claims that did not survive close scrutiny. Göbekli Tepe deserves better than that, so let's be precise about what the evidence actually suggests. Enclosure D, one of the oldest and best preserved of the excavated enclosures, has its two central pillars oriented toward a specific point on the horizon. Researchers, including the astronomer Juan Antonio Belmonte, have calculated that this orientation would have aligned with the heliacal rising, the first appearance above the horizon at dawn, of Deneb, the brightest star in the constellation Cygnus, at around 10,900 BCE, during the period of the site's earliest use. Deneb at this period was also very close to the North Celestial Pole, the point around which all other stars appear to rotate, which would have given it particular significance to any culture paying sustained attention to the night sky. Whether this alignment is intentional or coincidental is genuinely debated, but it is precise enough to require serious consideration rather than dismissal. More dramatic is the interpretation proposed by Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis regarding the vulture stone, Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, one of the most elaborately carved stones at the site. They have proposed that the animals carved on this pillar represent specific star constellations as they appeared at a precise historical moment, around 10,850 BCE, when a major cosmic event, possibly a significant meteor storm or cometary impact, may have occurred. The scorpion carved at the bottom of the pillar corresponds, in their interpretation, to the constellation Scorpius. The vulture corresponds to Sagittarius. The circle the vulture appears to hold corresponds to the sun's position at the summer solstice on the proposed date. If this interpretation is correct, the vulture stone is not decorative art. It is a record, carved in limestone, intended to persist, of a specific catastrophic event in the sky, encoded in a symbolic language designed to survive the people who witnessed it. This is, by any measure, a staggering proposition. It implies not just casual sky-watching, but systematic, long-term astronomical observation, sophisticated enough to track precessional changes, the slow shift of star positions across centuries caused by the wobble of the Earth's axis. It implies a mathematical, or at least geometric understanding of celestial cycles that we had assumed came much later in human development. And it implies that Göbekli Tepe was, in part, an archive, a place where dangerous, important knowledge was carved into permanent stone so that it would not be lost when the people who held it were gone. Whether or not the specific claims of Sweatman and Tsikritsis withstand the scrutiny of coming decades, the broader proposition that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were watching the sky with disciplined, organised attention and encoding what they saw in their most permanent work is now taken seriously by a significant portion of the research community. The stars mattered here. They were not background, they were part of the text. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer scale of the forgetting involved here, because it is one of the most extraordinary aspects of this entire story, and it tends to get glossed over in the excitement about the stones themselves. Göbekli Tepe was built around 9,600 BCE. It was actively used, regularly, intensively, by large numbers of people drawn from a wide region, for somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years. It was then deliberately buried, sealed under tons of rubble and fill, in a process that itself required enormous organised effort, and then, for the next 11,000 years, it was simply gone. Not just undiscovered, gone, forgotten. No ancient texts mention it. The civilizations that rose in this same region, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, kept detailed records of their own histories, their own sacred sites, their own cosmological beliefs. None of them appear to know that this place existed. The classical Greeks, who wrote about everything, wrote nothing about a vast prehistoric temple complex in Anatolia. The Romans, who catalogued the ancient world with considerable thoroughness, have nothing. Medieval Arab geographers, who travelled widely through this region and documented its antiquities with genuine care, describe nothing that corresponds to Göbekli Tepe. The Ottoman administrative records that covered this area for centuries are similarly silent. The people who built it took the knowledge of it entirely with them. Whatever tradition preserved memory of the site, whatever stories, rituals, or obligations kept it alive as a living place in human consciousness, ended at some point after the burial and left no detectable trace in any subsequent culture. This is a disappearance so complete that it almost defies explanation. Cultural memory is usually tenacious. Sacred sites, in particular, tend to persist in local tradition. Even when their original significance is lost or transformed, holy wells become Christian shrines, ancient henges become fairy rings, sacred groves become haunted forests. Göbekli Tepe left none of that. It became a hill. An unremarkable, scrubby limestone hill in southeastern Turkey that farmers ploughed around the edges of for millennia without knowing what lay beneath the surface. When the Kurdish shepherd first noticed the unusual stones in the 1950s, he was not discovering something that local tradition had forgotten. He was encountering something that had been genuinely, completely, categorically absent from human awareness for a span of time longer than all recorded history. When Peter Benedict surveyed the site in 1963 and noted some broken limestone and flint tools and assumed it was medieval, he was not making an unreasonable assessment given what anyone at the time had any reason to expect. The idea that a site of this scale and sophistication could exist in this region from this period was, by the standards of 1963 archaeology, essentially inconceivable. The paradigm did not yet have a category for it. Which is the other lesson here beyond the archaeology itself: the map is not the territory. The things we do not know how to look for are precisely the things we do not find. And the ground beneath our feet is still, in ways we have barely begun to understand, full of things we have not looked for yet. The construction of Göbekli Tepe was not a single dramatic event, not a moment of collective inspiration that produced a monument in a season and was then complete. It happened across centuries, which means that for many successive generations of people, coming to work on this site was not an extraordinary undertaking, it was simply part of a life. A seasonal obligation, a periodic pilgrimage, a recurring communal duty woven into the annual rhythm of existence, in the same way that certain hunts or certain harvests were woven in. People were born into a world where going to the hill and working on the enclosures was what you did at certain times of year, because it was what your parents had done, and their parents before them, reaching back further than any individual memory could go. Imagine what that workday looked like in practice. You rise early, not by choice, but by default, because the light and the noise of a camp waking up are not things you sleep through. Breakfast is whatever was set aside from the previous evening. Some roasted grain pressed into a rough flat cake, a piece of dried or smoked meat if the hunting has been good, something foraged and portable. It is eaten quickly, standing or crouching by the remains of the fire without ceremony or leisure. The day's work is pressing enough that extended morning rituals are not on the schedule. The walk to the quarry or to the enclosures or to wherever today's specific task is located happens in the growing light, in a group with the comfortable near silence of people who have been working together long enough that communication has become largely gestural and economical. Someone who knows, who has been here multiple seasons, who learned from an elder who has since died, who carries the accumulated understanding of how this all works, provides the direction. Not through hierarchy exactly, not through coercion, but through the specific authority of demonstrated competence. You follow because they know what they are doing and you can see that they know. The quarrying work is the most physically demanding. Lying on your side in the pale dust of the limestone ridge, striking at the rock face with a flint chisel and a stone hammer, trying to free a pillar from the bedrock by patient percussion. This is exhausting work that produces results at a pace that would be nearly unbearable to someone accustomed to power tools and visible progress. An hour of sustained effort might advance the cut by a few centimetres. The stone fights back. The flint tools dull and chip and must be resharpened or replaced. The dust is in everything. Your eyes, your throat, the creases of your skin. Your back aches in the specific grinding way that backs ache when you have been in an awkward position for too long, and there is absolutely no ergonomic solution available. There are no adjustable chairs in 9000 BCE. There is just the rock and the tool and your body and the very gradual giving way of one to the other. At midday there is a rest. Food again. Water from wherever water is sourced. A spring. A stream. Carried in containers made from animal skin or woven plant fibre. The rest is real, not performative. These are people who understand the value of pacing because they have no option of pushing through on adrenaline and coffee and recovering later in a heated office. Then back to work. Then the long light of the afternoon. Then the descent as the day cools. Then the fire. Then the communal meal that is both nourishment and the social glue that holds the whole enterprise together. And in the firelight, after eating with the carved pillars visible at the edge of the light and the extraordinary sky overhead, something is said or sung or performed that makes all of it feel not just worthwhile, but necessary. Required. The only possible thing to be doing with a human life. History has a persistent habit of forgetting its children, and Göbekli Tepe is no exception to this. The scholarly literature focuses, understandably necessarily, on the architecture, the symbolism, the logistics, the social organisation, the mystery of the burial. The children rarely appear in the analysis, because children rarely leave clear signatures in the archaeological record. But children were here. They had to have been. Communities that travel together travel whole, and a pilgrimage site that drew groups from across a wide region for periodic multi-day gatherings would have drawn those groups in their entirety. The old, the injured, the heavily pregnant, and the very young, alongside the able-bodied adults doing the quarrying and the carving and the hauling. A child growing up in the orbit of Göbekli Tepe, in one of the groups that returned seasonally, that considered the journey to the site part of the annual rhythm of life, would have grown up understanding it as simply part of the world, as ordinary and significant as the seasons, as unquestioned as the fact that the gazelle come from the north in autumn, and that certain hillsides have einkorn in summer, and that some stars rise before others. The trip to the hill was what you did. It was part of what it meant to be the people you were. The journey itself for a young child would have been the adventure before the adventure, days of walking through changing landscape, following paths that had been walked by parents and grandparents and great-grandparents before them, worn slightly smoother by generations of use, sleeping under open sky in country that might be different from the home range, different plants, different bird calls, the subtle geographical novelty that small children notice with an intensity adults have largely lost. The company of the whole group moving together with the specific social energy of people en route somewhere that matters, and then arrival. The sight seen for the first time, or rather seen again after a year's absence, which for a young child might feel almost like a first time each time. The carved pillars rising from the enclosures, taller than anything else you have encountered, covered in animals that seem almost to move as the light shifts. The particular acoustic quality of sound within the stone rings. Researchers have noted that the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe have interesting acoustic properties, producing echoes and resonances that would have been especially noticeable in a torchlit gathering. For a child who had never experienced anything built on this scale, the effect would have been overwhelming in the specific way that overwhelming things are when you are young. Not frightening exactly, but enormous in a way that exceeds your current vocabulary. You feel it in your chest before you understand it with your mind. And then the gathering. More people than you have ever seen in one place. Strange faces. Familiar rituals performed in slightly unfamiliar accents. The enormous shared meals. The adults doing something with the fire and the stones that is clearly not ordinary activity, but something set apart. A child watching from the edge of an enclosure, half hidden behind a pillar, too young to fully understand what is happening but old enough to know it is important. This child is receiving something that will last longer than any specific memory. A feeling. A sense that this place is significant, that these people gathered here matter, that the carved animals on the stones are watching, that the world has a structure to it that is bigger than any individual life, but that somehow includes and requires individual lives. They would carry it home, they would tell other children about it in the imprecise, luminous language of childhood memory. And when they were old enough, they would make the journey themselves and bring their own children, and the site would persist. To properly understand Göbekli Tepe, you have to be willing to let go of a comfortable assumption, not a stupid assumption, not an unreasonable one, but one that turns out to be wrong in ways that matter. The assumption is this: that symbolic thinking, religion, myth, ritual, cosmology, art, was something that emerged gradually as human culture became more complex and settled. That it was a kind of luxury, made possible by surplus and leisure and the security of a roof over your head, something that prehistoric people in their urgent, mobile, subsistence-focused lives could not yet afford. That the life of the mind, in its more elaborated forms, was a product of civilization rather than one of its ingredients. The evidence from Göbekli Tepe, and increasingly from other sites of this period across the region, does not support this. It actively contradicts it. The symbolic world of the pre-pottery Neolithic was not thin or provisional or waiting to be filled in once the practical problems were solved. It was rich, complex, organised, and apparently among the most urgent concerns these people had. The carvings on the pillars are not the tentative first attempts of minds just beginning to engage with representation. They reflect an already developed tradition, a visual vocabulary with conventions and established meanings, executed by artists working within a recognised framework. This tradition did not begin at Göbekli Tepe. It was already old when the first stones were raised there. Hunter-gatherers living in this period did not spend their days in pure pragmatic focus, minds entirely occupied with food acquisition and predator avoidance, with no cognitive bandwidth for anything else. They were fully modern human beings, neurologically identical to anyone alive today, with the same range of capacities, the same susceptibility to beauty and awe and terror and grief, the same ability to ask questions that material circumstances cannot answer. Why does the sun move the way it does? What do the dead become? What are we responsible for? What is the nature of the world we inhabit, and what are our obligations within it? These questions do not wait for agriculture. They are as old as consciousness itself. What Göbekli Tepe demonstrates, with an insistence that is difficult to argue with once you have sat with the evidence, is that the people of the pre-pottery Neolithic were not passively enduring existence while waiting for civilization to arrive and give their lives meaning. They were actively, deliberately, collectively constructing meaning on a large scale with considerable investment of labour and social organisation, in a form they intended to persist. The temple is not evidence of spare time or surplus energy. It is evidence of priority. These people chose to spend enormous quantities of their most limited resource, coordinated human effort, on something that did not directly feed them or shelter them or protect them from immediate physical harm. They did it because they understood it as necessary in a way that transcends the material. That is not primitive. That is a recognisably human position that any person in this room, at any point in the last 12,000 years, would recognise immediately. Before writing, before mathematics, before agriculture, before the wheel, before pottery, before almost everything we use to define civilization, there was this. People standing under the stars inside a ring of carved stone, asking the large questions in a shared symbolic language, and investing everything they had in the project of keeping those questions alive. The capacity that made civilization possible was present from the beginning. It just expressed itself, first, in stone. The world that produced Göbekli Tepe was not a stable world, and understanding its instability is essential to understanding why this site exists at all. The Younger Dryas, a sudden dramatic return to near-glacial conditions that interrupted the warming trend following the last ice age, lasted approximately 1,200 years, ending around 9,700 BCE, just before the earliest construction at Göbekli Tepe begins. The Younger Dryas was not a gentle cooling. It was rapid by geological standards, severe, and profoundly disruptive. Temperatures in this region dropped significantly within decades. The landscape changed. Forests that had begun to return under the earlier warming contracted or disappeared. Rivers changed their courses and their flow patterns. The populations of animals that hunter-gatherer communities depended on shifted their ranges, sometimes dramatically, and then, just as abruptly, it ended. The warming that followed the Younger Dryas was similarly rapid. The climate of the Near East transformed within centuries from near-glacial conditions to something approaching its modern character. Forests expanded again. Rainfall patterns shifted. Rivers swelled. The grasslands of the Fertile Crescent spread and thickened, bringing with them the wild cereals, einkorn, emmer, wild barley, that would eventually be domesticated into the foundations of agriculture. The world, in a very real sense, was becoming a different place within the span of living memory and the stories of the recently dead. For the people living through this transition, this was not abstract geological change. It was experienced directly, concretely, in the specific and intimate way that people who live entirely within a landscape and depend on it completely experience change. The migration routes of the gazelle shifted. Springs that had always been reliable ran lower. Hillsides that had been dense with grain became sparse. Familiar landmarks took on unfamiliar qualities. The world that grandparents described was not quite the world that grandchildren inhabited, and the difference was large enough to be unsettling. Rapid change of this kind has a well-documented effect on human social and symbolic life. It intensifies it. Times of ecological instability tend to produce increased ritual activity, stronger communal bonds, heightened investment in shared symbolic frameworks, the kinds of behaviours that buffer individuals against uncertainty by embedding them more deeply in collective meaning. The impulse, when the familiar world shifts beneath your feet, is to build something permanent, to carve something into stone, to gather with others and affirm through the physical act of gathering that the community persists even as the landscape changes around it. It is perhaps not coincidental, and several researchers have argued it is not coincidental at all that the construction of the world's oldest known monumental architecture began at precisely this moment of profound climatic and ecological transition. Göbekli Tepe may be, among many other things, the first large-scale human response to climate anxiety. Not in the sense of a practical solution. No amount of carved limestone changes the temperature or brings back the gazelle migration. But in the sense of a collective symbolic act that said, we are still here, we are still organised, we still share a world, and we intend to mark that fact in a way that will outlast all of us, and the uncertainties that are currently frightening us. That impulse is not prehistoric. That impulse is recognisable. The specific form it takes changes. The impulse itself has apparently been with us from the beginning. For years after its discovery and initial excavation, Göbekli Tepe was treated in the popular imagination as a singular anomaly, one impossible, inexplicable place in an otherwise broadly predictable prehistoric landscape, a glitch in the expected sequence, an outlier so far outside the normal distribution that it was easier to treat it as unique than to ask what it implied about the broader picture. This framing was understandable given how unexpected the site was, and how long it took for the scholarly community to process its implications. But it has been steadily and significantly dismantled over the past decade. A systematic survey and targeted excavation have expanded across the region of southeastern Anatolia and the upper reaches of the Fertile Crescent. Göbekli Tepe is not alone. It is one node in a network. Within a radius of roughly 200 kilometres of the site, archaeologists have now identified a cluster of related sites from the same general period, all displaying similar architectural traditions, similar symbolic vocabularies, similar evidence of large-scale organised human activity. The most significant of these is Karahan Tepe. Located approximately 35 kilometres southeast of Göbekli Tepe, the site was identified in the 1990s, but, with limited resources and many priorities competing for attention, was not properly excavated until the 2020s. What has emerged from those recent excavations is extraordinary, and, for anyone who thought Göbekli Tepe had already set the ceiling for surprise, genuinely unexpected. Karahan Tepe has T-shaped pillars. It has carved animal reliefs. It has evidence of the same kind of large-scale organised activity that characterises Göbekli Tepe. But it also has something more. Carvings of human figures executed in a higher relief, nearly three-dimensional, than anything at the older site. Faces emerge from the stone with an intensity that photographs cannot quite capture, but that visitors consistently describe as striking. A carved human head, life-sized, protrudes from a wall of bedrock with an expression that has been variously described as serene, watchful, and frankly unnerving depending on the hour and the quality of the light. A carved figure with prominent ribs and an erect phallus was found in what appears to be a ritual context of considerable significance. Karahan Tepe is not a lesser copy of Göbekli Tepe. It is a related but distinct expression of the same broader symbolic and architectural tradition, a sibling site rather than a satellite. Taş tepeler, meaning stone hills in Turkish, is now the collective designation for this entire network of related Neolithic sites in the region, of which Karahan Tepe is only the most extensively excavated new addition. Survey work has identified at least a dozen significant sites, and the probability is high that systematic investigation will reveal more. The picture that is emerging is not of a single anomalous community doing something unprecedented in isolation. It is of a culture, a widespread, regionally coherent, symbolically sophisticated culture, expressing itself consistently across a substantial landscape through a shared architectural and artistic language. Multiple communities, multiple enclosures, multiple nodes of the same network, all participating in the same tradition, all engaging with the same symbolic vocabulary, all oriented toward the same kinds of gatherings and the same kinds of questions. Göbekli Tepe was the first discovery, and it remains the most extensively excavated, and it will probably always be the most famous. But it is not the whole story. It is the first chapter of a much longer book, most of which is still buried under the hills of southeastern Turkey, waiting for the next Klaus Schmidt to arrive with the right questions and the patience to stay. And now we arrive at the central mystery, the burial. And it deserves a moment of silence before we walk into it, because it is the question that sits at the heart of everything about this place. The question that makes Göbekli Tepe not just archaeologically significant, but genuinely philosophically strange. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned carelessly, the way a site gets left when people simply move on and stop coming back. It was not slowly swallowed by natural accumulation over centuries of neglect. It was covered deliberately, methodically, intentionally, with enormous quantities of stone rubble, flint tools and animal bones. The accumulated material of the gatherings themselves, used as fill, packed in with a consistency and thoroughness that speaks unmistakably of organised effort and conscious decision. The scale of this effort is, when you sit with it properly, comparable to the scale of building the site in the first place. The enclosures are large, the pillars are tall. Filling a circular stone enclosure from the ground up to the tops of 5-metre pillars with tightly packed rubble is not something that happens accidentally or casually or in an afternoon. It requires material, enormous quantities of it, sourced and carried and deposited in a controlled way. It requires sustained labour, over a period of time that was probably not days but weeks, possibly longer. It requires coordination of the same kind that the original construction required. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe were working as hard at covering it as their predecessors had worked at building it. And they did it with what appears, from the archaeological record, to be care. The fill is not chaotic. It is not the random scatter of material thrown in hastily by people who wanted to be done and move on. It is consistent, deliberate, and in places appears to have been deposited in a sequence that suggests the burial was executed according to a plan that someone held in their mind before the first shovelful of rubble went in. The sequence of the burial is itself informative. The older enclosures appear to have been filled first, the more recently constructed ones later, suggesting that the process of retiring enclosures was ongoing, not a single dramatic event, but a practice extended across time, possibly across generations. Individual enclosures may have been buried ceremonially as their active ritual life was understood to be complete, while new enclosures were still being constructed and used elsewhere on the site. The site was not closed all at once. It was closed gradually, section by section, in what begins to look like a deliberate program of ritual retirement. Think about what that would have felt like from the inside. You are part of a community that has been coming to this place for generations. You have come here yourself since childhood. You know the enclosures, the specific feeling of standing between the central pillars of enclosure D, the quality of sound inside the stone ring, the carved fox on the east pillar that you have always looked at first, and now it is time to fill it in. The decision has been made. By whom, through what process, we cannot know, and the work begins. The rubble goes in. The animals and the flint tools, the material of past gatherings, are deposited as the fill rises. Slowly the carved animals disappear beneath the surface. The central pillars, the tall anthropomorphic figures that have watched over this space for perhaps centuries, sink below the rising fill one hand breadth at a time. Finally, the T-shaped tops of the pillars disappear. The enclosure becomes a flat surface, a memory, and work begins on carrying in more fill, more rubble, more of the past, until the surface is sealed and the hill is just a hill again. Whatever was sealed inside was meant to stay sealed, and for 12,000 years it did. Let's go through the main theories for the burial of Göbekli Tepe, because there are several worth taking seriously, and they each illuminate something different about the people who made this decision and the world they were navigating. No single theory has achieved consensus. The evidence, as is so often the case at this site, is rich enough to support multiple interpretations and definitive enough to rule out almost none of them. We are in the position of having to hold several possibilities in mind simultaneously, which is uncomfortable if you are the kind of person who prefers answers, but is the honest position given what we actually know. Theory 1. The burial was a completing act, a ritual closure rather than an abandonment. In this interpretation, enclosures had life cycles. They were born, used, and eventually fulfilled their purpose, at which point they were returned to the earth in the same way that a human body is returned to the earth after death. The burial was not the end of the site's significance, but the final chapter of each enclosure's sacred biography. This interpretation draws support from the care visible in the fill, the deliberateness of the deposition, the use of meaningful material rather than neutral rubble. You do not close something sacred with random dirt. You close it with the material of its own history. The animal bones and the flint tools are not waste. They are offerings or records or both. Theory 2. The burial was protective. As the region's population grew and shifted across the millennia of the site's active use, the communities who maintained Göbekli Tepe may have become aware of groups who did not share their symbolic world, who would not understand what they were looking at, or worse, who understood it and objected to it. Burying the most sacred structures put them beyond reach. What is underground cannot be defaced, cannot be stolen, cannot be repurposed by people with different values and different relationships to the carved beings inside. The buried enclosures were not destroyed. They were hidden, preserved, given to the future in the most secure form available. If this theory is correct, then the burial was an act of extraordinary foresight, a decision to protect something beyond the horizon of any individual life, in the hope that it would eventually be found and understood. It was, just 12,000 years later than planned. Theory 3. The burial was ecological necessity dressed as ritual. The activities associated with Göbekli Tepe over centuries of use, the deforestation required for timber and fuel, the massive and sustained hunting pressure, the movement of enormous quantities of stone across a limestone ridge, the concentration of hundreds of people in one place repeatedly, degraded the local environment in ways that eventually made continued use of the site unsustainable. The springs may have run lower, the game populations may have thinned. The practical conditions required to host large gatherings may have deteriorated below the threshold of viability. In this reading, the burial is the ritual form that a practical necessity took, as practical necessities often do in cultures organized around sacred obligations. The enclosures were not closed because they were spiritually complete. They were closed because the landscape could no longer support them, but because everything in this culture happened within a ritual framework. Even the closing took ritual form. Theory 4, and perhaps the most philosophically interesting of all, the burial was cosmological planting. The people of Göbekli Tepe may have understood the returning of their enclosures to the earth not as ending but as seeding, as placing something sacred back into the ground in the expectation, or at least the hope, that its power would be preserved and would eventually return in some form. You do not plant a seed and mourn it. You plant a seed and wait. The burial in this reading was an act of faith in futurity, a belief that what is placed carefully in the earth does not disappear but transforms. Whether they imagined someone would dig it up 12,000 years later and build a car park and a visitors centre and a UNESCO nomination is perhaps asking too much of any cosmology. But the underlying intuition that things returned to the earth are not lost turns out, in this particular case, to have been correct. Klaus Schmidt was 39 years old when he arrived at Göbekli Tepe in 1994 and quietly changed the history of history. He was a German archaeologist with the German Archaeological Institute, experienced in the prehistory of the Near East, the kind of scholar who had spent enough time in the field to develop the specific instinct for when something is not what it is supposed to be. When he looked at what had been written off as a medieval cemetery, the cursory assessment in the survey records, the brief notation of some broken limestone and a few flint tools, he recognised immediately that the assessment was wrong. The flint tools were not medieval. The shapes visible in the eroding hillside were not gravestones or field boundaries. They were the tops of large, precisely shaped T-shaped pillars. He recognised the form, he knew what it meant, and he started digging. What emerged in those first excavation seasons would have been enough to make a career for almost any archaeologist. A single large enclosure with monumental carved pillars predating anything comparable by thousands of years would have been extraordinary, but the site kept expanding. Every season revealed more enclosures, more pillars, more carved imagery, a greater and greater scale of organised ancient activity. Schmidt recognised early that what he had found was not just an important site, but a paradigm-shifting one, something that required not just adding a chapter to the existing story of human prehistory, but rewriting several of the foundational assumptions that story rested on. He said at various points that the site would take more than his lifetime to properly excavate. He was right about this in a way he could not have fully anticipated. He devoted the rest of his life to Göbekli Tepe. He directed excavations there for 20 years with a dedication that colleagues described as total, not obsessive in the anxious-driven sense, but in the quieter sense of a person who has found the thing they were meant to find and is fully present to it. He lived for significant portions of each year in Şanlıurfa, the nearest city, a place of considerable historical depth in its own right, situated in the landscape that Göbekli Tepe's builders had also inhabited. He learned the land and its rhythms. He built relationships with the local community. He spoke about the site with a combination of scholarly precision and genuine wonder that communicated itself to everyone who heard him. In the summer of 2014, with the excavation season ongoing and the site still yielding new findings, Klaus Schmidt was found dead in his apartment in Şanlıurfa. He was 59 years old. The cause was a heart attack. He had been at the site weeks before. He died, as fully as it is possible for a person to die in the middle of something. In the middle of something. He's buried near the site he gave his working life to, in a small cemetery within reach of the limestone ridge where the pillars still stand in their buried enclosures, most of them still waiting to be found. The man who discovered the world's oldest known temple did not live to see the full scope of what he had uncovered. The excavation that he began will continue for decades beyond his death, possibly longer. The questions he brought to that hillside in 1994 are still open, still generative, still driving research across the entire region. That is, in the end, exactly the right legacy for a person who spent his life at a site that had been asking unanswerable questions for 12,000 years. He added his questions to theirs. The hill is patient, the questions remain. Step back from the archaeological detail for a moment and look at the shape of what this site is telling us, because the shape is important and it is easy to lose inside the accumulation of fascinating specific facts. Göbekli Tepe is evidence that human beings, 12,000 years ago, before farming, before writing, before cities, before pottery, before almost everything we typically use as a marker of civilization's beginning, were driven by forces that are entirely recognizable today. Not familiar in a vague, abstract, we are all human sort of way. Familiar in a specific, concrete, you would recognize this if you saw it sort of way. The drive to build something larger than yourself. Not a shelter. Something larger than any practical shelter requires. Something that involves other people. That outlasts any individual contribution. That will be there after you're gone. This drive is present at Göbekli Tepe at full strength, 12,000 years ago, among people who had every practical reason to spend their limited energy on more immediately useful projects, and chose instead to move 20-ton stones up a hill. The choice was not irrational. The choice was deeply, recognizably human. The need to gather in community and mark time with ritual, to have occasions that are set apart from ordinary days, that involve specific actions performed in a specific sequence, that connect the people performing them to something larger than daily life. Every culture that has ever existed has this. It appears to be non-negotiable, not a cultural luxury, but a genuine human requirement, as consistent across history and geography as the need for food and shelter. Göbekli Tepe pushes the evidence for this back to the very beginning of the record. The ritual life of humanity is as old as the evidence goes. The impulse to make meaning out of the world, to look at the movement of stars and animals and seasons and ask not just what is happening, but what it means. To carve the answer into stone, to give it a form that will outlast you. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe are not decorative in the way that we use that word dismissively, as though decoration were a minor and optional activity. They are an attempt to render the symbolic world visible and permanent, to take the shared understanding that holds a community together across time and give it a shape that does not depend on any individual memory to survive. This is what writing will eventually become. But it was already happening in stone, thousands of years before writing, and the willingness to do enormous, exhausting, physically punishing work, not because it will make you warmer or better fed or safer from predators, but because something in you insists that it is necessary, that this place, this gathering, this carved pillar, this buried enclosure, that all of it matters in a way that cannot be measured in calories or shelter or security. The people of Göbekli Tepe were not less practical than we are. The evidence of their daily lives suggests they were very practical indeed, in the way that people whose survival depends on accurate assessment of reality tend to be. They built the temple anyway, despite the cost. Because of the cost, perhaps, because investing enormously in something sacred is part of what makes it sacred. We spend a great deal of time defining civilization by its external features, its technology, its agriculture, its cities, its written records. Göbekli Tepe suggests that the interior features came first, and that they were fully formed long before any of the external ones appeared. We did not become the kind of creatures who build temples because we developed agriculture. We may have developed agriculture in part because we were already the kind of creatures who build temples. The capacity that makes civilization possible, the capacity for collective symbolic meaning, for shared purpose, for sustained investment in something beyond immediate self-interest, was not civilization's product. It was civilization's cause, and it was already ancient when the first stone was raised on that limestone ridge 12,000 years ago, under a sky full of stars that no one alive today has ever seen. You're standing on a hill in southeastern Turkey, and it is 12,000 years later, and the work is still not done. This is worth sitting with before we close, because it changes the way the whole story feels. After 30 years of systematic, careful, internationally collaborative excavation, after Klaus Schmidt and his teams and the teams that have followed them, after the ground-penetrating radar and the photogrammetry, and the isotopic analysis of the animal bones, and the careful documentation of every carved surface, archaeologists believe they have uncovered somewhere between 5 and 10% of Göbekli Tepe's total area. 5 to 10%. The rest is still underground, still sealed in its packed rubble, in the darkness that has held it for 12 millennia, undisturbed, waiting. 20 or more enclosures remain buried, potentially hundreds of additional carved pillars, standing in their stone sockets in the dark below the surface, with their animals and their symbols and whatever else the builders placed among them when the fill went in. 2,000 years of accumulated material from a major pilgrimage site. The objects, the bones, the worked stones, the possibly modified human remains, the things we have not yet thought to look for because we have not yet found enough to know what questions to ask. All of it is still there. The site is, in a very real sense, mostly still a mystery. We have read the opening pages of a very long text, and we are beginning to understand the grammar, and most of the book is still closed. The excavation continues season by season, with a patience that the site seems to require and that the best archaeologists who work there appear genuinely to have. New findings arrive regularly, and they have the particular quality of good findings in an open field. They answer some questions and immediately generate several more. Karahan Tepe is yielding extraordinary new material. The broader Taş Tepeler survey is identifying new sites. Ground-penetrating radar is producing maps of the buried enclosures at Göbekli Tepe itself that will guide decades of future excavation. The field is alive with productive uncertainty, which is the best possible state for a field to be in. The uncovered enclosures are protected now under a modern shelter, a low, wide roof stretched above the excavated area, supported on steel columns that stand among the ancient stones without touching them. It is functional and slightly strange, the industrial present hovering respectfully over the deep past. Visitors come in increasing numbers, drawn by a story that seems to grow more rather than less compelling the more we learn about it. The paradox of a site that becomes more mysterious as it becomes better known. They stand between the carved pillars and feel something that most of them struggle to put into words, which is appropriate given that the people who built this place also did not leave words. And somewhere beneath the unexcavated portions of the hill, in the packed rubble and deliberate fill that has held them since the last enclosures were ceremonially closed, the buried pillars wait. The carved vultures, the foxes, the snakes winding their patient way across limestone faces in the dark, the anthropomorphic central figures with their carved arms and their belt-like bands and their absence of faces, standing in their stone sockets just as they were placed, oriented toward whatever point on the horizon or whatever point in the sky their builders meant them to face, utterly undisturbed by 12,000 years of everything that has happened on the surface above them. You could lie down on that hill right now, in the dark, with the extraordinary sky overhead, a sky your ancestors knew and that you have nearly forgotten how to read, and press your ear to the earth, and perhaps you would hear nothing. Or perhaps, if you were very quiet and very still, you would hear the specific silence of something that has been waiting a very long time to be found, and that is in no particular hurry, because it has already proven that it can wait. Sleep well. The hill will still be there in the morning. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not vanish. This is a point worth making clearly, because there is a tendency in popular prehistory to treat ancient peoples as though they existed in a sealed compartment of time, as though the hunter-gatherers of the pre-pottery Neolithic were a separate and discontinued human experiment rather than the direct ancestors of people alive today. The genetic record tells a different and considerably more continuous story. Ancient DNA studies conducted over the past decade have traced the biological lineage of the people who lived in this region during the Neolithic with increasing precision, and what they reveal is a population that did not disappear but transformed, that transitioned over millennia from the mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle of Göbekli Tepe's builders into the early farming communities of the Fertile Crescent, and whose descendants eventually spread across Europe, the Middle East and Central Asia, carrying fragments of that original genetic heritage into the present. The ancient DNA work on Neolithic Anatolian populations has been one of the more quietly revelatory developments in human genetics over the past 15 years. The picture that has emerged is of a genetically distinct population, distinct from the hunter-gatherers of Europe to the west, distinct from the populations of the Caucasus to the north, that was present in this region from at least the time of Göbekli Tepe's construction, and that became, over the following millennia, the primary genetic source for the first farmers of Europe. When agriculture spread westward out of the Fertile Crescent beginning around 7500 BCE, it spread not just as a set of techniques and crops, but as a population movement. The people who brought farming to Europe were largely descended from the same genetic pool as the people who built the enclosures on the limestone ridge, which means, if you are of European descent, the people who built Göbekli Tepe are among your ancestors, not metaphorically, biologically. The DNA that gave rise to the first farmers of Europe, who mixed with the existing European hunter-gatherers and eventually gave rise to the populations of the continent, traces back in significant part to the people of Neolithic Anatolia, the same broad population, living in the same landscape, participating in the same regional symbolic culture that built and used and eventually buried this site. This is not a small thing to sit with. The gap between the builders of Göbekli Tepe and the modern world is often framed as unbridgeable. 12,000 years is a very long time, and the differences in daily life and material culture are so vast as to make the comparison feel almost metaphorical. But the genetics remind us that the connection is not merely intellectual, it is physical. The woman who carried water to the workers quarrying a pillar on that ridge in 9500 BCE is in a direct biological line with people walking around European cities today. Her mitochondrial DNA may be in someone's body right now, on a bus, half asleep, heading home after a long day. The specific shape of her hands, the particular quality of her attention, the way she felt standing between the carved pillars at night, these things are gone beyond any possible recovery. But something of her persists. The line did not break. The people who built the world's first temple are not gone. They became us, and on some nights, standing under a very dark sky, looking up at the Milky Way with that specific feeling of smallness and significance that the sky produces in human beings and apparently always has, something in us recognizes something. We just do not always know what we're recognizing. Not everything carved into the stones of Göbekli Tepe is peaceful. Not everything here speaks of community and shared purpose and the quiet dignity of ancient humans asking large questions under a star-filled sky. Some of what is carved here is disturbing, and it deserves honest attention rather than being smoothed over in the interest of a more comfortable narrative. The headless human figures are the clearest example. They appear on multiple pillars, human forms carved in low relief, rendered without heads. In some compositions they appear alongside vultures that seem to carry spherical objects interpreted as severed heads. In others they appear in postures that suggest not serenity but aftermath, the specific stillness of a body after something irreversible has happened to it. Whether these figures represent the dead, the ritually killed, enemies' ancestors undergoing transformation, or something else entirely is a question that the carvings alone cannot answer with certainty. But the figures are there, and they were carved deliberately, and they meant something specific to the people who made them. Violence is not an intrusion into the sacred world of Göbekli Tepe. In the symbolic framework that the site appears to reflect, violence, death, transformation, the passage from one state to another, seems to be woven into the fabric of the cosmology itself. The vulture, the primary death-associated figure in the imagery, is not depicted as a threat or a punishment. It is depicted as an agent, something that does a necessary thing, that moves something from one state to another, that participates in a process the community understood as fundamental to the way the world works. Death was not the opposite of life at Göbekli Tepe. It appears to have been understood as part of the same continuous cycle, managed by specific beings and marked by specific rituals. The question of whether actual violence, sacrifice, execution, ritual killing took place at the site is one that archaeologists approach with appropriate care. The evidence does not currently confirm it. The human remains found at the site are fragmentary, and their context is complex enough to support multiple interpretations. The worked skulls, deliberately modified after death, possibly displayed, could reflect the treatment of revered ancestors whose remains were curated rather than buried, rather than the remains of individuals killed as offerings. Most researchers currently favour the ancestor curation interpretation, but the imagery on the pillars makes clear that whatever the actual practice was, death and its aftermath were present in the symbolic life of this place in ways that were not incidental or peripheral. They were central. This is, when you think about it, not surprising. The people who built Göbekli Tepe lived in close daily proximity to death in a way that modern life in the developed world largely does not. Animals died constantly in their presence, killed by their own hands for food. People died from injuries, illness, cold, and the accumulated attrition of a life lived entirely outdoors without medical care. The dead were not abstract. They were specific people, known and mourned, whose absence left gaps in a small community that felt them immediately and practically. A cosmology that included death as a central element, that gave it a symbolic framework and a ritual structure, that populated it with beings like the vulture who managed the transition. This was not a morbid preoccupation. It was a practical and psychologically necessary response to the actual conditions of life. Göbekli Tepe does not look away from the dark. It carves it into the stone and puts it at the centre of the circle, where everyone can see it, and where it can be addressed directly rather than left to operate in the shadows. There is something almost modern about that if you look at it from the right angle. There is something that happens to people when they stand between the pillars at Göbekli Tepe that is difficult to account for purely in terms of intellectual appreciation of archaeological significance. Visitors, archaeologists, tourists, journalists, local farmers who have known the hill their whole lives describe experiences at the site with a consistency that is itself interesting. The words that come up repeatedly are presence, weight, recognition, stillness, a sense of being looked at, a sense of time doing something unusual, becoming less linear and more layered, the 12,000 years between the builders and the visitor collapsing in a way that feels less like imagination and more like a genuine perceptual event. Whether this is the architecture working as intended, the enclosures were designed to produce a specific experiential effect, and they still produce it. or whether it is something more is a question that depends entirely on your prior commitments. Part of what the site does is purely acoustic and architectural. The enclosures are circular, which means sound behaves differently inside them than outside, voices carry differently, echoes arrive from unexpected directions. The space has a quality of containment that makes you aware of your own presence within it, in a way that open landscape does not. The pillars are tall enough to create a genuine sense of enclosure, even from a modern visitor's perspective, standing in an excavated trench below the original ground surface. The carved animals on the pillar faces catch the light differently, depending on where you stand and what time of day it is, giving the imagery a quality of movement and variability that a flat photograph cannot capture. The space is doing things to your perception that it was designed to do. The architecture is still working. But there is something beyond the acoustics. Visitors who are not particularly prone to spiritual experience, who came to the site as curious tourists or skeptical journalists, describe a quality to the place that they find difficult to categorize. Several archaeologists who have worked at the site for years speak about it with a particular kind of careful respect. Not the professional distance that academics typically maintain from their subject matter, but something warmer and less detached. Schmidt himself spoke about Göbekli Tepe with a quality of reverence that was visible to everyone who heard him, and that was not merely the enthusiasm of a scholar for his life's work. It was something more personal than that. Something the place had given him that he did not entirely have language for. What the site asks of you, perhaps, is a particular quality of attention, the same quality of attention that the people who built it were cultivating in the people who gathered here. The enclosures were not designed for passive observation. They were designed for participation, for presence, for the specific quality of awareness that ritual produces when it is working, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself, connected to the people around you, and to something beyond the present moment. 12,000 years of disuse have not entirely dissolved that quality from the stones. The design persists. The effect persists in attenuated form for visitors who are willing to be still long enough to notice it. You do not need to believe anything in particular for this to be true. You do not need a cosmology or a theology, or even a spiritual sensibility in the conventional sense. You only need to stand quietly between the pillars in the particular silence of a very old place and let the weight of the time involved settle over you. 12,000 years is not a number, it is a feeling. And the feeling when it arrives properly is remarkable, part vertigo and part recognition. The specific sensation of understanding for a moment how small and how continuous you are simultaneously. Let's be honest about the limits of what we understand, because honesty about uncertainty is part of what makes Göbekli Tepe so persistently compelling, and because the open questions here are as interesting as the settled ones, possibly more so. After 30 years of excavation, after thousands of academic papers and conference presentations and documentary films and popular books, after ground-penetrating radar and isotopic analysis, and ancient DNA sequencing and photogrammetry, and every analytical tool that contemporary archaeology can bring to bear on a site, we still do not know some of the most fundamental things about this place. And that is not a failure of the research. That is an accurate reflection of how much there is to know, and how much of the site is still underground. We do not know who specifically organised the construction. We have inferences the authority was probably rooted in shared, sacred obligation rather than political hierarchy, probably distributed across a regional network of communities rather than concentrated in a single group. But we do not know the specific social mechanism. We do not know whether there were particular individuals who held recognised authority over the site's construction and ritual calendar, and if so, how that authority was acquired and transmitted. We do not know the language or languages spoken by the builders. The pre-pottery Neolithic Anatolians left no written records, and the reconstruction of their languages from later evidence is speculative and contested. We do not know the specific beliefs that the carvings encoded. We can identify patterns, we can propose interpretations, we can connect the imagery to later symbolic traditions in the region, and make educated inferences about continuity. But the specific stories, the narrative content, the theological framework, the meaning of each animal in each position in each composition is not accessible to us. We are reading a language by examining its characters without a dictionary or a grammar. and while we can see that it is a language and begin to understand something of its structure, the content remains largely opaque. The carvings tell us something. We cannot yet say with confidence what. We do not know exactly why the burial happened. The theories we have discussed, ritual closure, protective concealment, ecological necessity, cosmological planting, are all plausible and none is proven. The archaeological evidence is consistent with several of them simultaneously, which may mean the reality was itself multiple, a decision made for several reasons at once, as most significant human decisions are. We do not know the specific sequence of the burial, which enclosures were closed first and last, and whether the sequence was meaningful. We do not know what the people who performed the burial said to each other while they were doing it, what they understood themselves to be completing, whether they grieved. We do not know what happened to the communities that maintained the site when it was finally complete and the gatherings ended. Did they disperse? Did they redirect their ritual energy to other sites in the Tash Tepeler network? Did the social structures that had organised the pilgrimage tradition dissolve as those communities transitioned towards settled agricultural life? Or did they persist in transformed form, carried forward in the ritual calendars of the first farming villages? The questions extend outward from the site in every direction, and most of them are currently unanswerable, which means Göbekli Tepe will be generating research and arguments and the specific productive excitement of a field that is genuinely open for as long as archaeology continues to be practiced. The hill is patient. It has more to say. We're still learning how to listen. Somewhere in the long, gradual process of the burial there was a last night, a final gathering, the last time the enclosures were lit by fire and filled with people who had travelled from across the landscape to be present. We do not know when this was. The archaeology cannot yet pinpoint the final active use of the site with sufficient precision to give us a year, a decade, even a century. We do not know how many people were present, or whether the final gathering was understood as final, whether the people who attended knew they were attending something for the last time, or believed, as humans tend to believe about the things that have always been there, that there would be another season and another gathering after this one. What we can say with certainty is that at some point, the rhythm that had held for 2,000 years, the coming and the going, the building and the feasting and the ritual in the firelit enclosures, stopped, and someone, on some night that is now lost to us entirely, left the site for the last time without knowing it, or knowing and leaving anyway, because the work was done and there was nothing else to do. Let's stay with that night for a moment. The fire is lit. The enclosures that have not yet been filled are still intact. The carved pillars still standing in their sockets, the central anthropomorphic figures still facing each other across the ring, their carved arms still resting at their sides in the posture that has not changed since they were raised. The animals on the pillar faces are alive in the firelight the way they have always been alive. The fox frozen mid-step, the vulture leaning slightly forward, the snake winding its patient way along the edge of the stone. The acoustic quality of the enclosed space is the same as it has always been. Voices carry in the particular way they carry here. Echoes arrive from unexpected directions. The space holds sound and presence in the way a cupped hand holds water. The people gathered are doing what people have always done here. Eating together, probably. The communal meal that has been the practical and symbolic heart of these gatherings since the beginning. There may be ceremony. There almost certainly is, because the ceremonies do not stop until the ceremonies stop, and on this night they have not stopped yet. There is the specific quality of a gathering that has been repeated enough times to have worn a groove in collective memory. The familiar sequence of actions, the known words or sounds or movements, the comfort of a ritual that connects you simultaneously to the people around you tonight, and to everyone who has stood in this same place and done this same thing, going back to great-grandparents and their great-grandparents, and further back than any individual memory can reach. And then the fire burns lower. People begin to sleep, the way they always sleep after the feast, in the warmth of the gathered group. The stars wheel overhead in their 12,000-year-old patterns. The last person awake sits for a while in the quiet, listening to the breathing of the others, looking at the carved pillars in the dying light. Whatever they are thinking, they leave no record of it. Eventually they sleep too. In the morning, people will begin to travel home, back to wherever their range is, back to the daily rhythm of foraging and hunting and the management of survival. Some of them will come back, some of them won't. The enclosures that remain open will be used for a while longer. And then, at a point we cannot identify, they will be filled. The rubble will go in, the pillars will disappear below the surface, the hill will become a hill, but tonight the fire is still burning, the carved animals are still watching from the stone, the people are still here, sleeping in the warmth of a gathering that has held them for as long as anyone can remember. Tonight, the last night, is the same as all the nights before it. And that is, when you think about it, exactly as it should be. Sleep well, you're in good company. You are in. The hill has been keeping watch for 12,000 years, and it is not about to stop now. And so here we are, at the end of 12,000 years, give or take. At the end of a hill in southeastern Turkey that turned out to be one of the most important places the human race has ever stood. At the end of a story that is, if we're being honest, nowhere near its end because most of the site is still underground. Most of the questions are still open, and the hill is still out there right now, patient and dark and full of things we have not found yet. But you have found your bed, and that is enough for tonight. Think about what you have carried through this darkness with you. The people who rose before dawn, on a cold Neolithic morning, and walked to a limestone ridge to do work that would outlast them by 12,000 years and counting. The children who sat against the base of carved pillars and felt something they had no words for. The artists who lay in the dust with flint tools and gave animals to stone with a skill and intention that still stops researchers in their tracks. The communities who came from across a wide and largely empty landscape, season after season, generation after generation, drawn by something that was not hunger and not fear, but something older and more insistent than either, the need to gather, to mark time, to stand together in a firelit circle and acknowledge that the world is large and strange and worth paying attention to, and then the people who buried it all, who packed the rubble in, layer by careful layer, until the carved animals disappeared and the great pillars sank below the surface, and the hill became a hill again, who sealed 12,000 years of future discovery into the earth and walked away, into lives we cannot follow, carrying the memory of this place until the memory too was gone. They were not so different from you. They asked the same questions you ask in the dark when the day is over and the noise has finally stopped. What does it mean to be here? What persists? What is worth the effort? They answered those questions with 20-ton stones and carved foxes and deliberate loving burial. You're answering them tonight in your own way, which involves a blanket and a voice in the dark and the long, slow loosening of a day's accumulated weight. The oldest temple on Earth was built by people who had nothing, no cities, no writing, no agriculture, no wheel, and who built something anyway, because the impulse to reach towards something larger than yourself is not a product of civilization. It is older than civilization. It may be, in fact, what civilization is made of. So tonight, as you settle into the warmth of wherever you are, maybe offer a quiet and slightly sleepy acknowledgement to the hunters who moved mountains for reasons they could not have explained in any language we would recognize, but that we somehow understand anyway, who gathered under the same stars you cannot quite see through the ceiling, who were, in every way that matters, already entirely themselves, already fully human, already asking, already building, already here. The hill is still there, the questions are still open, and you, right now, are the latest in an unbroken line of people who looked up at the dark and wondered what it meant. You are in excellent company. You always have been. Good night.